Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to, I really like to thank Chap and Dr. Simpkins for inviting me and allowing me to share some of my research with you tonight. And let me say, this is really outstanding to see a crowd like this on a Friday night. If I were doing this in San Jose, I'd probably have 3 people. This is great. Again, my research over the last several years has been in the Caribbean. It's mostly been focused on environmental change in association with the development of the sugar industry beginning in the 1600s. So I've been looking at issues of capitalism and environmental change, and at the same time, slavery. But that's not the only thing I'm going to talk about tonight. What I'm really going to be looking at is a little bit about I'll give you a roadmap. A little bit about the burden of archaeology and the image of archaeologists in the public mind. I'm going to talk to some degree about the different fields of archaeology, the subfields that appeal to me and I hope appeal to you. And then also spend some time on my latest research projects in the Caribbean that include an historic preservation project for an historical society on a small island. Perhaps you've heard of it, Nevis. Nevis and St. Kitts, and also recent work by a couple of my graduate students that included the excavation of a 1,000-year-old burial. So I'll begin here. A few words about archaeology. I know some people have gotten into archaeology because they're trying to avoid modern politics, but I would like to inform you that archaeology is as deeply embedded in politics as possible, and not everyone enjoys that, because when you are engaged in archaeology, you are in fact dealing with the direct relic or the direct information pertaining to people's cherished traditions and beliefs and myths and national identities and ethnicities. And so inevitably what you do will have repercussions. It will have ripple effects. And this was widely recognized by a number of prominent individuals in the 20th century. In particular, Stalin said, those who own the past control the future. And what he really meant by that was if you control access to history, access to knowledge about your people, about your culture, you have control. And those who control that are the ones who can dictate the future. He also famously said, those who vote decide nothing, those who count the votes decide everything. Very important to keep in mind. In addition to Stalin, we have another individual who, in the 20th century, sought to use archaeology in service of state ideology by eradicating the histories of other people as a means of pushing a particular political agenda. This is something that must be kept in mind when doing archaeology, especially as an American doing archaeology in another country, especially when I am dealing with archaeological sites that have something to do with the history of another people, and that history includes slavery. So it's an important issue that I also keep in mind when I'm working with descendant communities, or I'm working with sensitive issues related to people's heritage, that I'm aware that archaeology really begins in the colonial project. It really begins as a piece of imperialism. Now, archaeology also has an interesting image in the public mind. If you were born after 1980, and I think a lot of you were, your image of an archaeologist might be a little twisted. Every time I fly down to the islands and the person next to me says, "Oh, what do you do? What do you do?" So I'm an archaeologist. So, oh, I just love dinosaurs. I just love dinosaurs. I do too, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm not digging up dinosaurs. I'm working with ancient cultures. I'm working with the remnants of industrial processes, shipwrecks, historical items, occasionally prehistorical settings, but always with people, not with dinosaurs. And you might also have a different image of what an archaeologist is. How many of you recognize this image of an archaeologist? Right? When I was growing up, that was not an image of an archaeologist. Perhaps this is your image of an archaeologist. My favorite is coming next. It comes from a Halloween costume I saw online. The reality, though, is often quite different. I do not own a bull whip, although I do take students in the field on field school projects, and there have been times when a bull whip would have been very useful. The truth is that archaeology comes from a colonial background. A more common image in people's minds has more to do with the Victorian period, more to do with the Edwardian period. Anyone into steampunk? At the recent, last year's Dickens Fair in San Francisco, this was a steampunk-oriented archaeologist. But again, the image in people's minds is a little bit different from the reality. Now, my favorite archaeologist, by the way, is not Thomas Jefferson, but he was the first archaeologist in America. He was the first to come up with a really radical idea, which was that the layers in the earth, the layers of the earth from the surface of the ground down, get older as you dig down deeper. Now, we might say to ourselves right now, well, why would he do that? So obvious. It wasn't so obvious in the middle of the 1700s. The earth was unchanging. The concept that there were different times represented in the depths of the earth is a profound concept and fundamental to archaeology. When we look at stratigraphic levels, it is helping us date. It is helping us go back through time. And it was a fundamental discovery. His second most important principle was something called principle of association, which is that artifacts and items found in the ground at a particular level, if they're all found at the same level, might possibly be related in time or related to the same culture. So these are important concepts that, even though emerging only in the middle of the late 1700s, are still very much a part of the core practice of archaeology today. So the real image of an archaeologist today might be, instead of a pith helmet, a hard hat. You might be working in an urban environment, for instance. You might be involved with high-tech means of recording space and spatial dimensions of an archaeological site. Archaeologists are often called also into issues having to do with social justice. For instance, excavation of mass burials as this one in South America, or perhaps in Bosnia and Herzegovina, places where there have been massacres, where there have been mass graves of people being tossed in as a result of religious or political strife. So archaeologists are often called in for a variety of different reasons, primarily because they have skills to engage in forensic recovery of human remains and not lose important data. Working with artifacts, oftentimes very small things, and if you see the Indiana Jones films, they're popular, you've got a huge idol or a crystal skull or something of that nature. But really, most of the time, we're dealing with just bits of trash. Broken pottery, glass, bottles, medicine bottles, shoes, little pieces of people's lives. Things that were discarded, things that were broken, things that people never thought anyone would ever look at again. But we can piece together people's lives and entire households based on small clues. Another of my interests is maritime archaeology, or nautical archaeology. It used to be always referred to as nautical archaeology because it was focused primarily on shipwrecks. But today, maritime archaeology looks at bigger issues than simply shipwrecks. But it is a subfield in archaeology. We use the same techniques, but we just bring them underwater. It's a little bit more difficult logistically, but here a grid is laid out over the remains of a shipwreck, in this case using PVC pipe. Photography is being engaged in this case. You'll see a lot of images tonight that have people taking notes. The notebook is probably the most important tool an archaeologist has. The notebook is your document of what is occurring, what you're finding, because we have an unusual facet in the science of archaeology, in that when we are excavating, when we are digging something up, we are destroying our site. We can only dig it up once, so we have to do it right. And so we record everything that we are finding as we're finding it in depth, in 3 dimensions, and we use every available technology that help us do that. Archaeologists gravitate to the latest technology, like flies to, like monster candles. They will, whenever possible, introduce the newest technology into the field, and oftentimes implement technologies even before they know how to use them properly. So maritime archaeology, and there are a couple of institutions in the United States that focus on this, looks at shipwrecks, looks at harbor works, looks at ancient transportation and communication. We're beginning to find a lot of evidence now of communication between the American South and the Mayan region. Something that 30 years ago we couldn't imagine, but now we're beginning to find solid evidence of that. We take a lot of equipment under water for our documentation. On a project I was involved on just a few years ago in Jamaica. We did this for the National Geographic Channel. We were trying to create a virtual 3D reconstruction of the lost sunken city of Port Royal. And this is some of the equipment we took down. What made it more complicated was that there was a British film team that was simultaneously filming our project, which was documenting the remains of the city of Port Royal, which is sunk in Kingston Harbor, with a French team that was doing the 3D photography. But they were also doing a documentary on a father and son Canadian underwater film crew. So you had a filming of a filming going on at the same time. And then they had an American version, a French version, a Canadian version, and a British version of the film. And I've seen them all, and it's interesting how they differ. So all the underwater video equipment is brought down, and this is Port Royal as we imagined it in the year 1692 when it sank during an earthquake and tsunami. At the time, it was known as the wickedest place on earth, and the governor of Jamaica that was Henry Morgan. Yes, he really exists. He's just not, they didn't make him up to put him on a label of rum. He really did exist. And what we were doing, this is an artist's interpretation of what Port Royal looked like in 1692 when the earthquake hit. More than 18 acres of this city was destroyed. The sand spit suffered liquefaction and went straight down. And what we were doing was excavating in this region here of a tavern, and so what we were finally able to do with the 3-dimensional photography was create a virtual image for future study. The reason I was called in to be participating in this project was that I have been working in the Caribbean for a very long time. Jamaica is all the way off to this end, but I've been working since the late 90s on a small island of Nevis. You may have heard of St. Kitts, maybe not of Nevis. Nevis is one of the very smallest of the islands of the Lesser Antilles of the Caribbean. And it used to be one of the wealthiest and most important of the British colonies. You've all heard of the 13 original colonies, right? Forget that. There were 18 original colonies. 18. But 5 of them are in the Caribbean. Nevis, St. Kitts. We have Montserrat. We have Barbados and Antigua. Most of them wanted to join in on the revolution, but being islands, it was very difficult for them to do so, and they were blockaded by the British Navy. Famous American statesman was born on this very small island, Nevis. If you have a $10 bill, you will know who I'm referring to. Alexander Hamilton was born on this island, and they're very proud of it. He left the island by the age of 6. Had no impact on the history of the island, but they are very proud that he was there to begin with. This very small island, when Admiral, or previously Captain Horatio Nelson, later Admiral Nelson of the British, was sent to Nevis to blockade the island from continuing to trade with the brand new United States in 1777, he wrote a letter home to the Admiralty saying, these people on Nevis are just a bunch of Americans. And what he meant by that was so disrespectful of British authority. This is the island of Nevis, if you were to travel there today. It's a volcanic island. It hasn't erupted. They used to, when I started working there, refer to it as a extinct volcano, but it does have thermal hot springs. Just a few years ago, they changed that from extinct to dormant. Sounds a little ominous. But there hasn't been an eruption there for 50,000 years, so I'm thinking pretty safe. The island is shaped, it's circular, shaped a lot like a candy kiss, dominated by Mount Nevis, and the population surrounds the island. This island was a lignum vitae rainforest when it was first settled in 1628, but within just 50 years, practically denuded to within 2,000 feet up the mountain for the purposes of clearing the land for sugarcane production. Sugar became an incredibly important commodity of the Atlantic economy, and it was sustained by governmental support and the industry of slavery. The import of slaves from Africa replaced the first slaves, who were Irish, and maintained as a steady presence in the Caribbean. When Hans Sloane, who eventually founded the British Museum, traveled to the island in 1675, his diaries and accounts tell us a great deal. He's explaining that, in fact, very early on they had already deforested the island for sugarcane. In 1600, the average person consumed less than a pound of sugar a year. It was extremely expensive. Today, the average individual, and it would be all of us, consumes 157 pounds of sugar annually. And if you're a teenager, 163 pounds of sugar, mostly in the form of soda, but it's just been Halloween, and so maybe we should up that a little bit to 200 pounds. Sugar was a luxury commodity, but eventually, because of mass production in the Caribbean, it became a staple. It became an important part of people's lives, and then so important a staple that it was required. There seemed to be like an incessant demand. More and more and more sugar was required. More and more people wanted to get involved in sugar production. It's not an easy thing to produce. So my research in the last several years on this particular island has been focused on the sugar industry and how it developed from the 1620s all the way up until the decline of the sugar industry really in the early 1800s. But in the context of slavery and in the context of capitalism. Because one of my theoretical premises is that since capitalism didn't really exist as we know it in the 1600s, how did it emerge as a socio-political system? How did it become such a complete economic and social system that today seems natural to us? But if you were there in 1600, you would not have envisioned yourself as part of a capitalist system. So we begin by surveying the island with an eye towards trying to find the earliest plantations, and then the next phase of plantations, and the next phase of plantations, so that we can track through time the different developments, technological developments, spatial developments, and the incorporation of slaves. This quote is really wonderful because he's talking about Barbados, which had only been settled about 20 years before this statement. And that entire island had been stripped from, as he said, from the planter's point of view, having too many trees to deal with and not having to import wood. Same's true in Nevis. By 1680, this rainforested island was importing wood, importing timber for construction from Virginia. So rapid environmental change to put in a product that is very water intensive and labor intensive. But there's so much wealth to be absorbed. This is the island of Nevis, a very quick road map, really. modified slightly. The areas that are shaded are the areas that we have intensively surveyed. Now, it's all still forested today, but it's mostly invasive or introduced plants. If you go to the Caribbean today, you really won't see a native flora and fauna. You'd have to go to the island of Dominica to see that. If you go here, the advertising brochures for the tourist industry say, come see a pristine, untouched, tropical paradise. But most everything there is either from Polynesia or Mexico or Africa. Very little original vegetation is to be found at all. But it's a very dense forest today, and it involved physically surveying the land, walking out there to see vestiges of the former plantation landscape. Bob mentions the importance of place. Many of these places have meaning to local residents who are themselves descendant of former enslaved Africans. And so oftentimes when we go to these places, people will come up and ask us what we're doing. We talk about our study, and they'll inform us based on family traditions of what was here and what was there. I remember one fellow from an organization called Earthwatch, which takes people on archaeological projects for a fee, and he was working at a plantation site called New River. And they were excavating what he thought was the boundary zone in time between pre-emancipation and post-emancipation. And he was working on the foundations of an old structure that he thought might just bridge that point in time, which would have been about 1833. And this old timer wanders up to him and says, "Oh, you found the old ice cream store." He remembers back in the 1940s there was an ice cream store in that very location. So here you can probably just make out, this is a plantation road. This is a cobblestone road. It is lined with coconut palms, which were often used decoratively until the decline of the sugar industry, and then they were used for coconut oil plantations. What we can see in this landscape, the remnants of a road, and whenever we find something like this, we follow it as far as we can. Often I have students on my field schools, and one of my favorite things has always been to say, when we're in a survey, "Oh look, it looks like a use path. It looks like an old historic road." Okay, the two of you, go follow that, and I'll see you at lunchtime. Let me know where it goes. And usually they show, it goes to this great ruin and everything. The risk management office at the university has told me I can't do that anymore. Don't tell them that I still do. It's between you and me. Okay. Recent studies of the Caribbean environment have shown that, not just on Barbados, but many other places, a change in the environment. That's what we were looking for on, and certainly there has been a change. This plantation used to extend out quite a bit further, but coastal erosion has undermined this sugar plantation. This one's known as Indian Castle because the estate factory was built directly on top of an indigenous Carib Indian village. The Caribs didn't build castles of any sort. This was Indian Castle. It used to extend out quite a bit further, but it's been undermined by wave action, rising sea levels, and also wave action, partly because the barrier reef, the coral barrier reef that extended around the island, was mined for the lime. Why would they need the lime? Well, the lime goes into the mortar for the stone construction, but also lime is used as coagulant in the process of purifying sugar. The whole process is rather strange. You have to begin by crushing your sugar cane and then taking the juice, and you've got to work quickly because in 3 days it's rancid and you've lost your harvest. You then boil it. It's kind of loose juice in the beginning, but you boil it to a particular consistency, and all the impurities come up to the surface, and you skim that off, and then you check the temperature. And the slaves, who were the sugar masters, would check that temperature with their elbow, and they would look at the consistency and know when to strike or when to move the sugar from this cauldron to the next cauldron with a different fire beneath that. And the whole process was carried out for a couple of days until it got down to a really dense, thick, dark, material called muscovado. It was a syrupy muscovado sugar, and it was put in barrels and then allowed to drip and to start to cure. Now today, if you go to some restaurants or some little packets, something called sugar in the raw sugar, what you're getting is not raw sugar. There's too many impurities in actual raw sugar for your health. What you're getting is coarse granulated sugar that has had molasses put back in. But in these days, you're getting the muscovado sugar, which is the non-granular sugar that still needs to condense. And it still has that dark molasses, and the drippings, the gooey, sticky drippings are collected because that's where you're going to make your rum from. And then the sugar is in these barrels, and it may take 3 months for that to cure to a particular level. But they weren't allowed in the British colonies or the French colonies to purify it any further. It's part of the capitalist enterprise now. These plantations, these extractive plantations, are allowed to manufacture the sugar only to a certain point, and then it's sent back to the colonial core state, back to England, back to France, where it is further refined. In other words, they are sustaining a separate refining industry back in the home country. So the planters are growing it, they're producing it to a certain point, and then the sugar is being sent back where they're keeping people employed in the next step of the sugar refining. Can you imagine a ship loaded down with barrels of muscovado sugar, which has a little hole in the bottom of the barrel? These are hogsheads. They weigh about 1,500 pounds. Big barrel. I could easily disappear inside of one of them. And which reminds me of a story, but I'll skip it for now. The sugar is being shipped back to England or back to France, and it's still dripping. Now it takes a month or so to get back to Europe from the Caribbean, and the sugar is dripping down into the hold of the ship and then mixing with the bilge water. It must have been a wonderful soup down there in the bottom of the ship, because some of these barrels would lose up to 1/3 of its weight in transit. Okay. So by the time it arrives, it has mostly finished the curing process. It's mostly a dense, thick sugar, and then it's further processed. The story I was going to tell has to do with Horatio Nelson himself, who has the tie with Nevis, having been there as a captain. When he was killed in the battle against the French, before he died, he made a couple of requests. He'd been an admiral at sea his whole life. He had been at sea, and when he was near death, he said, "I have final requests. One, I want to know the outcome of the battle." He said, "Sir, you've been victorious." And he said, "I do not want to be buried at sea. I want to be buried back in England." And they agreed. They said, "Okay, we will agree to that." But he's out in the Mediterranean when he dies. How do you get him all the way back to England? It's going to be a long time. Well, the British Navy at that time, and they still do, had daily rum rations to all sailors. So they opened a big hogshead of rum, and they put Admiral Nelson in the rum. They didn't have any surgical spirits. They simply put him in the barrel of rum and sealed him up, hoping that the alcoholic spirits of the rum would preserve his body well enough till they could get back to Gibraltar and then overland back to England for his state burial. Well, they arrived in Gibraltar, the British colony of Gibraltar. His body was offloaded. The sailors aboard the ship demanded the barrel of rum back. And they got the barrel of rum back, and they all took their mugs and they dipped into the barrel of rum. And they drank a toast to Admiral Nelson. And everyone agreed that that was a full-bodied rum. I learned that from a British sailor, so it's got to be true. So my research into the Caribbean sugar industry was framed by a search to understand the emergence of capitalism as a social system and an economic system. And I worked from a couple of different thoughts on this. One, that capitalism begins to really emerge in the 16th century as new forms innovative forms of credit were evolving, banking was evolving. A small coffee shop in London called Lloyd's began to allow planters and shippers to share the cost of the ventures. This Lloyd's coffee shop eventually became Lloyd's Insurance Company of London, one of the biggest insurance companies insuring shipping to this day. The necessity of having agents and managers in these islands helps stimulate the development of a managerial class, very important for the development of capitalism. My theory was that the plantations in the Caribbean are the focal point where this begins to really shape up. This industry was sustained by slavery, and Nevis was at the center of that. The Royal Africa Company founded their headquarters on Nevis in 1675, and nearly every African transported by British ships into the New World stopped at Nevis first for sale before they went off to the other colonies, including the American colonies. And finally, as the plantations developed and capitalism strengthened it, this influenced spatial dynamics, this influenced social behavior that helped create the capitalist class systems and changed the environment in very particular ways. The changed environment is just not a product of capitalism or just a product of agriculture, it's a product of concepts about the utility of an environment, the productivity of an environment, how it should be divided up into efficient units, how the space is going to change. These are different concepts that today we take pretty much for granted, but they weren't always the same. So one of the beauties of working in Nevis is that the environment still holds vestiges of the colonial period. Large, robustly built plantation factories, steam engines still in place from the 1870s, and this is long after the sugar industry had collapsed, long after Michigan became the center of the sugar industry, using beet sugar primarily, and also Santa Cruz, when Klaus Spreckels began to develop beet sugar industry up in the Bay Area. The introduction of new capital, new technology. So I take a lot of students with me to document all of these different structures that we have found across the landscape in different parts of the island. And I basically have gone over these particular aspects of my research was if in fact capitalism is emerging in the Caribbean and the plantations, there are certain things I should expect to be able to find. And that's largely how my research proceeds. We're not going to have a test later, you don't need to take notes. But why study it? Why study capitalism? And when you think about archaeologists, after you get past the dinosaur bone part, what's the point of studying anything through archaeology? There are many different issues that relate to the modern world. Historical archaeology is often called the study of the modern world. Capitalism is very much a part of the modern world. It is related directly to social inequalities and economic inequalities. And if we can understand the roots of those facets of our society, then perhaps we can adapt and change and understand where we're going in the future. Now, because I'm really keen on environmental change, I have looked at how the concepts of capitalism have affected the environment. The Caribbean is a great place to do that. So the next sets of images are really about some of the archaeology in the field. I've given you as much theoretical lecture as I'm going to tonight. This is a large plantation structure that is in the middle of the jungle today. A lot of the plantations, when the sugar industry collapsed, a lot of the planters just went home. They gave up. They left the island. They still own property. So even though today the island of Nevis is no longer a British colony, much of the land is still owned by descendants of the former planters. So you have descendants on the island of the former slaves, and the property largely owned by the descendants of the original slave owners. So we see this sort of replicating itself as well. This is just this past summer. We're working at an estate known as the Hamilton factory estate. This factory belonged to the uncle of Alexander Hamilton. I'm looking to get the Hamilton Society of America to fund my next research project, especially in light of the fact that the musical has regenerated people's interest in Alexander Hamilton. Notebook. Forever the notebooks, always recording notes in the field. Here are just some images of working in the factories, the kind of artifacts we really find more often than not, elements of industrial machinery. This particular one was interesting because from the leg of a cotton gin. When sugar began to fail, some of the entrepreneurial plantation owners shifted from sugar to cotton. They would also continue to produce sugar for the purposes of making rum, when the cost of rum and the value of rum was higher than sending sugar back for refining. These are all San Jose State students engaged in a field project. A couple of this, Shelby there's from a small college in Texas. When we run archaeological field schools out of San Jose State, it is not closed to San Jose State students. If any of you are ever interested in going on an archaeological field project, just send me an email. And maybe we can include you. The university doesn't care who we bring as long as your check is good. It's a great way to get actual experience in the field. We live together, cook our own food. That most of the time works out. This just gives you an idea of the kind of conditions that we're working in. Had this been 150 years ago, that would have all been clear, and you would have been able to see to the next sugarcane field. This is the site, the Bush Hill site, which we used as a field school for about 5 years. We didn't know all these structures and such were there. They're completely enveloped in forest growth. It took us 5 years to figure out all these buildings were there. We have the windmill tower, the sugar factory itself, the blacksmith shop, the great house for the plantation owners, an older factory and a kitchen, slave quarters over here. Eventually installed a steam engine in that location. The kinds of artifacts that we find in this site include iron kettles for boiling up food. This was found in the district for the enslaved African housing. Engine parts, boilers. So we're always finding interesting things. This excavation is directly in front of the great house, where we found marbles, clasps, clothing clasps, a small piece that I couldn't recognize, but it looked so familiar. And then one day I was in Healdsburg, California, up in Sonoma, and there's a gentleman with a hotel there, and he has a private fan collection. Fans for the last 300 years, and as I was staring at this one fan, I suddenly go, that's it! That's what that is! It's the little clasp on the bottom of the fan that holds the pieces together. So I started to get a sense of life at this household from these small artifacts, pieces of porcelain, pieces of pewter. I could not do this without the students. They're meticulous in their work and very dedicated. The other issue of the Caribbean is also species extinction. And it's not just environmental change in the form of landform change, it's different species going extinct as a direct result of clearing away the forest, clearing the habitat in which creatures live. Introduction of new species. There was one gentleman who gave a scientific paper in 1789 in Paris on localized temperature change and potential regional warming. He even hinted at global warming. His name was Benjamin Franklin, and he gave this scientific paper to the French Academy with reference to their colony of Guadeloupe. And the direct result of that was the colonial authorities passed the legislation forbidding the clearing of forests too close to any of the rivers and lakes and watercourses, because it was being found that that was affecting local temperatures. The temperatures were going up too hot, too hot. this quote from the historic text is referring to a particular iguana. There was a kind of iguana on the island of Nevis that grew to 6.5 feet in length, and it was an important food source for the local populations. And almost the first thing the British did was eradicate it, both as a food source and also because it just reminded them of something that needed to be destroyed. But to compensate, they began to introduce foreign species. The first botanical garden in the Caribbean was founded by the French on the island of St. Vincent in 1725, and they were trying to figure out which plants would work commercially in the Caribbean, and they assumed that things that they were finding in Polynesia and the South Pacific might work in the Caribbean as well. And many different plants were introduced, but if you go to the island of Nevis today, you will see plants from Mexico, as I mentioned, Africa, Polynesia, South America. Very hard to find until you get near the top of the mountain where sugar won't grow because of the microclimates. You get up to the top of the mountain, then the flora changes dramatically to bromeliads and ferns and things that are so big. I mean, it's amazing. But in other places, the erosion has been significant and dramatic. And I'll show you this site, which is eroding away off the coast, has exposed 1,500-year-old deposits of the indigenous peoples of Nevis. They formerly were known as the Carib, from which we get the term Caribbean, but the remnant population today on the island of Dominica prefers the name Kalinago, so I will refer to them as the Kalinago henceforth. This site inspired us to come back a couple of years later because as we were walking along, one of my students looked down and said, "Is that a crania?" Yes, it was. And we then came back the following year with permission from the Historical Society to do a salvage excavation. There was a burial basically eroding out of the shore. And we felt it important to recover that and not let it just be washed away. So here we're excavating that skeleton. Turned out to be a female of about 30, about 5 feet tall, dated 950 AD. And that was just the beginning. We went back this year with a graduate student because last year, as we were surveying this area, again, we found yet another crania emerging from the shore. So we did an excavation into the midden, into this mound, to get some stratigraphic information. The different levels have microfossils, small shells, little artifacts that let us date these soils. And in the process of doing that, came down on a set of burials. And so this was just this past summer. You can begin to see these burials emerging. This is my grad student, Marissa. This is going to be her thesis. She's specializing in forensic archaeology. Here's my favorite picture. That she's very meticulous. We are using little brushes, mascara brushes, little wooden potter's tools, so that we don't damage the bone in the process. At the same time, last summer, we were trying to document the Hamilton estate for historic preservation purposes. And we experimented with some new technologies. We brought a drone with us this year. And this is the windmill tower, and this is where the steam engine is. A number of other artifacts were emerging. These are huge iron doors that used to go on the factory. Here the students are documenting the curing house. Some of the relics around the site. And I wonder if I have just a moment. Right, so we made use of a drone this year. One of my students is a certified drone pilot. He now has a consulting firm called Indiana Drones. If you need his services at all. We wanted to experiment for historic preservation purposes how we could document the site and how we could extend our survey into the bush. So he began to do flyovers And what we're doing now then is downloading this using some 3D modeling software. So we're producing a digital model of the site, and our goal is to print out a scale of the archaeological site. It's a little bit jerky, but it's normally a lot smoother. This unit is about the size of a toaster oven, has a GoPro camera affixed to it, 4 propellers. He's taking lots of pictures as well, so not only do we get video footage, but we get hundreds of still images as well, which can then be used and stitched together with various kinds of software. There's a great one, an app you can download on your phone that's made by Autodesk called 123D Catch, and you can just put that on your phone. You can take pictures of something and make a 3D model. It's really great thing to do with a friend's head. You can shoot 20 or 30 pictures. So you can see the density of the forest. And in that forest, I could send students in there and lose them all. Or we can fly over like this and get an idea of what to expect. And this should finally come down and look at the archaeological site itself. A few houses nearby, and there's the ruins of the Hamilton Sugar Factory coming up. On the right, we have dozens of flyovers. You see the chimney tower for the boiling house, a lot of the equipment, the steam engine, the pilot. Oh, actually, that's one of my spotter students of the pilot. You can just see them here off to the left. It's our total station for the survey, and then a safe landing. With the work I have been doing on Nevis underwater as well, what sustained this industry, what sustained the colony was military force. The British had a powerful navy, the French had a powerful navy. They were in constant conflict throughout the 1600s and 1700s, and mostly causing economic disruption. Well, there was a great battle, the Battle of Frigate Bay in 1782, in the narrows between Nevis and St. Kitts. And one of the ships, HMS Solvay, was sunk during that battle, and we investigated this wreck. We located it for the first time, and this is strange. We went to the British Admiralty, we went to the Naval Records Office. We knew that the Solvay had sunk. We could not find a map, an Admiralty chart, anything that would inform us where to find it. And then one of the students said, just Google it. Damn, that's where we found it, right? There was a map, and pinpointing where it was, and we went out in a small boat and located the wreck. And we were interested in that wreck for the purposes of understanding another component of the emergence of capitalism and state control and state protection of the industry. I think John is fending off. Just kidding. Just kidding. Actually, he was telling me in a picture. Artifacts that we brought up have to be conserved. Most of these were brought back to the conservation lab at Texas A&M University, and then they were brought back to the island of Nevis to be put on display in the public museum. We use various technologies like XRF, or portable X-ray fluorescence, to do chemical analyses of the soils, analyses of pottery. It gives us a chart, something like this, that lets us know the constituent elements that are contained. This helps us understand something about the manufacturing processes. We use, obviously we use technology poorly, but I'll go right to this one, which is to acknowledge the various people who have participated in this research over the past several years. Michigan State University, when it first sponsored my going to the Caribbean back in the 90s, and all these other organizations, and I especially want to thank Subfields again for inviting me to share this research with you. Any questions, comments, feedback, complaints? Yes?
What else did you study there? Did you study like animals and natural disasters, or, well, obviously you mentioned natural disasters. So I'm particularly interested in how you mentioned that with natural disasters, because I'm kind of studying biology right now, so I'm a pre-veterinary science major. So I'm interested in academic studying that in biology right now. With how, well, I mean, we kind of did that with the snail lab with Charles Darwin, and I liked how species evolved and how they extinct, and like, did you go into depth with that or not?
Well, we were primarily there to do archaeology rather than zoology or botany, but we did look at that environment. One of my students is an environmental archaeologist. So we're interested in the changing environment. So the excavation column gives us information about the changing environment by using what are called indicator fossils, specific remains that help us recognize temperature changes and that sort of thing. Most of our knowledge of the plant and animal life there comes to us through ethnographic resources. The number of species on the island that have been eradicated are evident more in the fossil record than they are any other place. I mean, the British introduced so many different animals to the island that it completely changed the natural ecology. So it has a very different ecology today than it did just 400 years ago. And that is something that can be very closely studied. It just wasn't the focus of our project. But it could be the focus of your project.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the trend in Caribbean plantation system to not feed slaves? Do you find archaeological evidence of them having to have their own gardens and find their own sources of food?
There's both documentary and archaeological evidence that a lot of the planters barely fed their enslaved populations and did give them provision grounds to supplement their diet. But it's also evident that in that process, they're actually enjoying a better range of foods, a more diverse diet than were the planters. Using the XRF machine, for instance, let me just give a real quick example. When we use that on the ceramics that the planters were using, we find extremely high lead content, whereas the pottery that the slaves themselves were making has no lead in it at all. So they weren't absorbing lead into the diet. But also in the slave households that we've excavated, we find remains of different kinds of vegetables and fish and small game. I mean, they're not getting beef and that sort of thing. They're getting fed very poorly. And in times of stress, they were basically only feeding them the crushed sugarcane stalks, which is essentially what they fed the cattle. But we do find evidence of the provision grounds. We do find evidence of what they were collecting, what they were producing. And it included, like I say, a wide variety of birds and lizards and snails and fish and things of that, and chicken and things of that nature. But yeah, there is good documentary evidence and physical archaeological evidence. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that.